The whole point of all of this is to make housing more affordable for more people.
Hello and welcome to Housing Insiders, the podcast for founders, builders, lenders, and regulators, and anyone who believes that everyone should be well housed. I'm Jonathan Lawless.
And I'm Jeremy Potter. On Housing Insiders, we're hosting the conversations you won't hear anywhere else about how to make housing more innovative and attainable.
Yeah, and again, we're proud to partner with Bill Rewards, who obviously has an interest in helping renters buy homes, and they're not going to buy homes unless we have more homes. So really proud to partner with Bill Rewards and talk about things like this.
And if you like the show, please review it. That helps us spread the word and make more of these podcasts on these topics that help you and I understand everything in this industry.
And Jeremy, it was great to see you yesterday at the National Housing Supply Summit at the Home Builders Office yesterday in Washington, D.C. I thought it was a great conference, great to hang out, and something that I think we'll talk about more in future episodes. And we'll certainly talk about it today. Let's bring in our guest because I know he's got his own thoughts on how to tackle this this supply challenge.
Yeah, it's particularly relevant. This is a supply week, and it's going to be the topic for the foreseeable future for this country. And we're happy to have Jim Parrott on the show. Jim Parrott is the co-founder of Parrott Ryan Advisors and a non-resident fellow at the Urban Institute. Jim and I have this in common. He's a lawyer by training, but neither of us are practicing anymore. Jim served in the Obama White House as a senior advisor to the National Economic Council and as counsel to Secretary Donovan at HUD. Jim, welcome to Housing Insiders. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. It's fun to see you in your 2D forms. I wish we were doing this over beer somewhere, but I'll take this if I can get it.
Agreed. Right. And who's to say this coffee mug doesn't have beer in it? So
don't ask, don't tell.
Well, I'm just going to start by noting, we're going to talk a lot about GSEs and some of the things that we can do around housing supply. But given that right now it feels like every 5 minutes there's another piece of news coming out in terms of what Bill Pulte is doing at FHFA. So, Jim, I just kind of want to start with what's happening right now. What's the latest you're hearing? What's your take on the change in the board? I saw you quoted in Politico, but just give me a rundown of what you're seeing right now at FHFA and the GSEs.
Yeah, it's funny. You watch the wildfires of chaos and all these other segments and think, man, I'm glad it's not hitting my shores yet. And I guess we were naive to think that they wouldn't eventually consume our space too. But here we are. My sense is we seem to be in one of two spots. Either what we have is a private equity guy that is treating his role as conservator much like he would treat his role taking over a company, where you sort of roll up your sleeves and take control and sort of get under the hood to figure out what works in your acquired entity and what doesn't, and how you can get efficiencies and all that. And so this could be something out of that playbook where you get your loyalists on board and you begin to sort of look for efficiencies and all that. That's one possibility. The other possibility is a somewhat more unnerving possibility, which is that this is the first stage of a sort of DOGE-like intervention that we've seen at FHA, HUD, and elsewhere. And it's a really important distinction, because if we're on the first path, then at least they're solving for a successful, functional set of institutions that do what they're supposed to do better than they do today. And, maybe he finds ways to improve them. Maybe he discovers that they actually work better than he thought. And so he cranks down on DEI and clean energy stuff, or whatever it is that the Trump folks want him to focus on, but then largely leaves the critical infrastructure intact. If this is a DOGE effort instead, then they're not solving for, as far as I can tell, better functioning institutions. They're solving for much less staff, much less activity. And if that's what they're doing, if we really are in a world in which we're looking to take the GSEs from 15,000 or however many employees there are down to 5,000 or the like, then that's going to be a very bumpy road. We're going to be in a pretty disruptive groove here for quite some time that will spill over into the, outside of the mortgage finance space and into, the housing market generally. And I hope we're not on that path, but I think at this point it's just hard to tell. And then the other takeaway from this is I think there was a lot of attention in the transition once Trump had won and before he took over on this notion that we would see them focusing on spinning the GSEs out, on like day one. And there are a lot of reasons to think that they would focus on that, given how they thought about this and what they did in Trump won. I think that this move largely takes that off the table over the near term, just because they pushed out a bunch of board members who know the mortgage space quite well, folks like Mike Hyde and Kevin Chavers and folks like that, and put in folks that apparently know more about traveling to the moon than they do about the GSEs. And more importantly, they put the regulator in as the chair of the enterprises. And if you're having to go out and raise private capital to pull the GSEs out, there's nobody that's going to invest $1 in institutions that have the regulator as the chair of their board. So it feels like we're in a different phase for the GSEs. We're going to be in a different kind of policy frame of reference for a little bit while they do whatever it is this next phase is for them. But it feels like the recap and release effort, to the degree we see it at all in this administration, has been sort of set aside for the time being.
And I mean, Jim, you've written a lot about it, and I think have made points that I think both parties agree with, which is you're not going to do recap and release if it's going to negatively impact mortgage rates. It's just that would be against everything that they promised during the campaign, and it would be bad for America. And it just doesn't feel like everything I've read and everything I've heard, recap and release doesn't come with lower mortgage rates. There's just not a world in which lower rates are possible, but there are a lot of worlds in which higher rates are possible. So what I heard you just say and what you said in Politico is that like the early tea leaves, if you will, I don't know what it means to read tea leaves, but the early indications are that you fire the board, you put yourself in charge of the board, you make a lot of comments about how you want to do this thoughtfully and not immediately. It just feels like GSE reform is definitely not the priority. I mean, I don't know if I can jump to that conclusion, but it also feels like, to your earlier point, like, is this a private equity thoughtful takeover a company or DOGE? To me, it almost feels like the belief is that the DOGE approach is the private equity approach. So I think they're going to try to do exactly what you said. I mean, we saw, I think the latest I've seen was a 10% reduction at FHFA. We haven't heard anything outside of Craig Phillips, who is obviously brought in to think about recap and release, another indication that might not be a priority, but heads of, DEI have been removed. And as of 10:15 this morning, I haven't heard anybody else, but it does feel like, let me just call it the very aggressive private equity approach mixed with a delay in recap and release feels like where we are today.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the question is more where are we on that spectrum? Because that's a broad spectrum. There's a smart, thoughtful version of a private equity, takeover, that lands you in a more efficient place at the end of it. And there's the ham-fisted version where the folks jumping in to make the cuts think they know more than they do, and they break more than they fix, and all that. So who knows? Even if we really are in the private equity lane more than the DOGE lane, if one can distinguish them at all, there's still a fair amount of uncertainty as to where that takes us. I just hope that we're not in the more extreme DOGE lane where we really are just cutting for the sake of cutting, and we wind up not with 10% cuts at Fannie and Freddie, but 30% cuts. I mean, if by the time folks listen to this, we've lost the DEI offices and the folks at Fannie and Freddie that were meant to implement the things that they're now cutting policy wise. That's not great from my perspective as a progressive, but it's not destructive to the market, really. We can live with that. If instead they're cutting, they're moving aggressively for the sake of numbers, in the way that is happening at FHA, as far as I can tell, that's a more unnerving place where things that we all need to work will not work so well, if at all. So that's the red flag, I think.
Yeah, Jim, that's one interesting piece of this that makes it so complicated is we're hearing, and I don't mean to play in the rumor mill at all, but just talking to people day to day at the GSEs, they are seeing DOGE already in the offices with their laptops, sitting there taking notes, starting to evaluate. And so to your point, I guess to put a finer point on it, if, the equitable plans go away, but the core business stays the same, is very different than, starting to really challenge the core businesses and how they operate, one of the questions that came up yesterday was, could the entities compete against each other once again? And do these folks have enough runway and insight to like undo some of the UMBS and other aspects that cause the GSEs to look alike and now return them to a more competitive market position, much the way you'd think of private equity, thinking about two different companies instead of one company? Do you have any insight on the pros or cons of thinking about it that way?
Yeah. So, well, that gets us into a broader GSE reform challenge, which is, if setting aside the private equity piece of all this, although that would be an accelerant to this challenge, I think, if you really are trying to get them out in the way that the Trump folks have suggested they would like to get them out, or Calabria suggested he would like to have gotten them out, then you move them away from the largely synced up utility like model that they've provided us for the last 16 years, in which their systems are aligned, their securities are largely fungible. We now have a single security. They're issuing off a single platform. Their AUS is synced up. Their appraisals are synced up. They just feel like two sides of one big utility coin. And I think it's been great. One can argue that they would deteriorate over time in conservatorship, which is, a real concern. But as far as their day-to-day functions, I think they're playing the role we needed them quite well. If you need them to function as privately owned entities outside of conservatorship, competing with each other and competing with other sources of private capital and other channels in the mortgage market, they're going to have to distinguish themselves from each other. They're going to have to begin to offer different products, different ways of doing similar products. Their securities are going to become less fungible. Their prepay speeds are going to be different. The UMBS is not going to work anymore. I don't know how you could imagine they would. I don't know how the securitization platform, which is a joint venture between the two and gives them this prohibitive advantage over everybody else. I don't know how do you keep that going without sort of violating the principle that these guys, meaning the Trump administration, are presumably operating under, which is you want to level the playing field between the GSEs and everybody else. And so it just feels to me like what one would want out of releasing these guys in the way that the Trump folks are likely going to want to release them is going to be at extreme tension with what we like of the GSEs providing today. And there are just 101 versions of that tension that they'll have to wrestle with as they get closer and closer to getting them out. The answers to which I just don't have a great feel for. Like, it feels to me like we're going to give up a lot of what we like in the GSEs if they ultimately get that far. It's one of the reasons why I'm skeptical they actually get into the end zone. My assumption is what we've now got is a giant distracting halftime show that's going to take up the next year. And then once they get back to the game, or maybe it's a pregame show, they get back to the game, they get down to, I don't know, the 5-yard line, because I do think they'll make progress in this. And I think it'll become clearer and clearer to everybody how painful that last 5 yards is going to be, and the political cost of doing it. And to Jonathan's point, the risk that you're going to drive up rates, not by like 5 basis points, but by, 75 basis points or more, that kind of thing. I think all of the costs of success in this are going to become clearer and clearer. And I think my guess is they can ultimately decide that the cost is not worth the benefit. I mean, the benefit is going to be a very small number of rah, recap and release folks who are in a very small bubble that we hear, because we're in the same bubble, we hear from all the time. But when you go out and talk to people on the street and you say, hey, guess what? I'm going to release Fannie and Freddie. And they're like, well, I don't know what Fannie and Freddie are, but what's going to happen to my mortgage rates? Well, they may go up by 75 points. Like, in what world does that make sense politically? So I don't know. I'm a little skeptical.
Unless you cut the 10-year to negative 2% or something, which might happen.
Right.
But
when Don Jr. is running the Fed, that's what'll happen.
Yeah, that's right. Two quick thoughts. I mean, one is the idea that competition would be a way of like creating innovation at the GSEs and let's say pre-recap and release, just even under conservatorship, is a joke. I mean, at the end of the day, one GSE starts to perform better and their securities perform better, the other GSE dies. And it's no secret that one GSE was on its last legs and was sort of bailed out. And I think the idea that competition in this market with two players, people just don't understand how this game works, which is just all about price and securitization for two big insurance companies. But the other thing I'll say back to the private equity point, I was at Fannie Mae from 2000 to 2021. When I started, we were roughly doing the same number of acquisitions that they're doing today, with about 1/5 1/4, maybe 1/5 of the number of employees. Since then, the number of compliance and oversight and risk folks has grown immeasurably, largely in response to the fact that the number of directives and oversight requirements have grown immeasurably from the director. The technology teams have grown immeasurably, marketing, communications, in addition to DEI and other things like that. So, the one thing I would just caution us to think about is like, there is a core function the GSEs play. Their capital markets team is 150 people at Fannie Mae. They're the ones who are day in, day out, making sure that liquidity is happening. But what are the other 8,000 people doing is kind of an open question. So I think there is a lot of change that could be made without disrupting the fundamental functioning. On the other hand, the one other tea leaf that I'll just throw out there is that there's a new Twitter hashtag, make housing great again. And, Pulte has made a couple comments about like, people at the GSEs who are working hard and showing up to the office are going to be rewarded by being at a company that's going to do great things. If we put that comment in the context of it won't be releasing the GSEs from conservatorship, it will be doing great things while in conservatorship. Obviously, we'll talk about what we can do on supply there, but how should we think about doing great things at the GSEs in conservatorship?
Yeah, to me, it segues right into the supply stuff. So I think big picture, we are remarkably fortunate in this country, for whatever historical reasons, to have these giant utility-like companies managing the infrastructure of the housing and finance system. Like, it's just almost unprecedented worldwide that we've got these things in place. And as a result, we're the beneficiaries of one of the most impressive housing finance systems like in the world. And it's largely because of these institutions that make available to us long-term prepayable, fixed rate mortgages, which you just don't find in other places. So I think to the degree they can focus on doing that utility-like job well, with stability, with a large government footprint that has all kinds of benefits of stability and otherwise that they bring with it, I think that's in our sweet spot, and that's what they ought to focus on, making sure they do extremely well. But I think what they can also do, and this will bring us into the supply part of all this, is, right now we've got a giant supply problem in the country, and the GSEs are really well positioned to be helpful. And historically, at least recently, it's just not been where they've been focused. It's not been where their support of the market has been focused, for understandable reasons. They've been a demand side focused set of institutions. But there is potential, I think, for them, with not too dramatic shifts, to be really helpful doing for the supply side just a small piece of what they do for the demand side that could really help the nation grapple with a problem that I don't think we're going to get over unless policymakers help us with. This doesn't feel like a screwed up market that if market players just, are smart enough, eventually they'll solve. It feels to me like we've got a math problem that we need policymakers to help us a bit with.
Just a way to think about that too. Just in terms of numbers, right? Population growth, call it 1.5 to 2 million per year, depending on the level of immigration. Total construction right now, or total building permits, 1.4, and a deficit of something like, estimates run between 1.5 and 7 million, but a lot of homes that need to be made up. And the way I've sort of come to think of this is that if you're a private market person coming in to solve this problem, it's a temporary problem. You come in, you solve it, then you're out of business. And so, anyway, I just wanted to reiterate your point, is that if there's ever a time for a government to step in, it's to do these short-term temporary fixes to get us back to normal, and then let private market sort of run on the rails that it should run on. So I say that for two reasons. One is to quantify a little bit of why the government should be involved, but also to say the government, this is, and we'll talk about some of the specifics, but nothing that we talk about should be thought of as, well, we should have the GSEs do this forever, or as utilities, we should keep them around because they can do these things. I think the idea is that if they do these things, it needs to be time bound. Go fix this one short-term problem and then stop doing it.
100%. And the other way to think about it too is this is not asking HUD to build houses, right? What you're hoping to do is have the GSEs or other institutions help facilitate the entrance of more private capital into the space. At the end of the day, like, we need lenders to lend money, and we need builders to take that money and build houses, and they're private lenders and they're private builders. So this is all finding ways to increase the amount of private capital flowing into a space in which we don't have enough of it flowing in yet. I see this as the government using its advantage to help shift the playing field enough that you have more private capital coming in to take advantage of profit maximizing opportunities that aren't there right now. And as a result of their absence, we're not seeing the private market do what we need, which is build more houses.
Jim, can we dive into the weeds there for a second to better
Yeah.
understand the supply side tools and capabilities at the GSEs? Because on the demand side, it seems like the number one thing that unlocked the market was standardization, right? The ability to automate the mortgage process from point of sale through the capital markets. And that efficiency is what you mentioned earlier, transformational in comparison to the rest of the world even. And then also the cost of capital. And the cost of capital did exclude private capital to a degree over the last 15 years from making other loans, let's say. They make those loans really well.
Right.
The private lenders make those loans really well, but exclude kind of other private capital. So applying that same mindset here, there's no question we need the standardization and consistency that was brought to the demand side to be brought to the supply side. Can you talk about the effect that might have, though, on private capital participating on the supply side?
Yeah, I mean, the way to think about it is right now, in the absence of a government-backed kind of channel on the supply side to help expand liquidity, the private market's having to figure it out. And in the way that it figures it out on the demand side, some folks figure it out, but they figure it out in a way that is very niche-y and around the edges. It's not scalable and tends to happen at the top of the market, just like what happens on the demand side. It serves the top of the market with very high-end construction, which is all fine. Kudos to them for figuring it out, and I'm glad they're building what they're building. But it tends not to work down into the middle, much less the bottom of the market. In the same way that if you didn't have a government channel on the demand side, I could go out and get a loan tomorrow. It might be a little more expensive, but not like appreciably more expensive. But first-time home buyers would struggle. Those underserved communities, middle market, firemen, that kind of stuff. Like those folks get left out of that niche-y, higher wealth serving PLS market or portfolio sort of market. So in a similar sense, on the supply side, in the absence of a more scaled government-backed channel to get it started that has deeper liquidity, that's more standardized and all that, it's not that the market's not served at all. It's just not served in a deep, comprehensive way that we need. And as a result, you're not seeing construction in the middle and the bottom of the market. So what to your point about the way, big picture, the way to think about what the GSEs can bring on the supply side that's similar, at least conceptually, with what they've done on the demand side is it would be very helpful if we had some kind of secondary market for lending on the supply side, right? Right now, almost all the lending is done by portfolio lenders that make a loan, put it on the balance sheet, which is great, but there is a limited number of lenders out there that are willing to put this kind of debt, the debt that we need to see the construction we need, on their balance sheet. And so that ends up being a really binding constraint on the world of construction, because the amount of liquidity that you need to make that world robust is itself quite constrained by the portfolio limitations that you would see, on the demand side as well. And so what you need from the GSEs, I think, is, some help supporting a secondary market to create liquidity for whichever part of the construction industry we feel like we need in order to fill the gap that we need to see filled. So that's kind of how I think about it at a high level.
I think that's so well said. And we don't fuck around on this podcast. So we're going to take a break and come right back and just say exactly what we think the GSEs should be doing on the supply side and how they should do it, and what sort of things we've heard as to why they shouldn't, but why those reasons are not valid, especially in light of where we are as a country today. Let's take a break and come back and give our advice and thoughts on what we should be doing.
I love that. We don't fuck around. We're taking a break, though.
This episode is brought to you by Built Rewards. Built is a rewards program, just like an airline program, that is centered around your home and neighborhood. But instead of earning miles for flying, Built rewards you for paying rent, no matter how you pay. As a member, you can earn points at over 20,000 local restaurants, local merchants, and those points are now the most valuable rewards currency. You can use it to book travel on Amazon or even towards a down payment.
Built is revolutionizing housing. If you want to learn more, email John at lawless@builtrewards.com.
Welcome back. We're talking to Jim Parrott, and we're going to dive into what Fannie and Freddie could and should be doing around the supply side for new homes and the housing crisis. John, you were at Fannie Mae, and you told me the other day that you know this is already doable. Do you want to set the stage with what you meant by that the GSEs are already capable of doing something in this space and just really putting it into prime time and getting it off the shelf? Tell me more about your experience and why you believe that.
I led product development for several years at Fannie, and those years were years in which we had the initial realization that supply was going to be a problem, and we did research and figured out, some areas where the GSEs could step in. And Jim and I have talked about this, and so I want to start with one, and we'll go through some of the other lesser ones. But by far and away, the biggest one was what Jim just mentioned: is the GSEs have been authorized in the past by HUD to do what's known as AD&C financing, acquisition, development, construction finance, literally buying land, developing land, constructing land. They can participate in the stack of financing AD&C. So setting that as the stage, Jim, thoughts on AD&C, where Fannie can play, what they've done in the past, and what they should do now?
One gating question one has as a regulator, as a CEO, as a leader at these institutions, although with Pulte, we have all three and it's just one guy. We just go to as the leader, as the chair, is what kind of loans do we want to help create the secondary market for? And I think of there being two big categories here. One is loans that cover just construction, or development construction. And then the other is land development construction. And so if you start with the first, there's a product called construction to perm lending, which is a loan that a builder takes out before they put a shovel in the ground after they've got the land, that they then use to capitalize building, that then becomes like a traditional construction mortgage once the building is up. So it starts as an uncollateralized loan that once you've got a building up, becomes a collateralized loan. That's different from what you have today because Fannie and Freddie today really only provide funding for collateralized loans. So they're not going to give you a loan until the building's up and they've got some collateral. Freddie will now, as of somewhat recently, give you an interest rate lock. So they'll tell you what kind of rate you'll get in advance, which gives you some interest rate protection, but it doesn't give the builder what they need, which is liquidity on the front end. So with a construction to perm loan, you're not just giving them an interest rate lock, you're actually giving them the capital they need. It then converts to a collateralized mortgage over time. So that's one category. You can go one step further.
Sorry, Jim, just to be clear on that, on the construction to perm, that's on a single property, right? That's a consumer financing a single acquisition of a single construction. Because today, the way that it typically works is you get a bridge loan, you wait till the property is complete, then you either refinance or modify that loan into the permanent loan, as they say. Oftentimes, that's used in the context more of like an individual buys a plot of land, hires a builder, builds it. But I think the way that you're describing it, which is also, I think, super valuable, is even if Lennar Homes was building the property today, they take a deposit, they build the property, the consumer then gets financing and a loan when it's complete. And what construction to perm then allows is, instead of them financing between the period that they find the consumer who wants to build and the completion, they finance it on day one and no longer have to capitalize. And then the interesting option that is available to the GSEs is you just escrow those initial payments too. So I can come in, get full financing via Lennar mortgage on something that is ultimately going to be my long-term loan, I won't have to pay until I move in. I just want to make sure, like, this is a single home either being purchased on land that you're buying and constructing or could be used for a large tract build.
It could be for a larger development. I don't think of it as a multifamily kind of thing as much as I do. If Lennar Homes went and built 200 homes, I think it could work for that as well. I mean, traditionally, it's a single family focused move, not a multifamily focused move. But it doesn't have to be just for me who's buying a home that Lennar is going to build. It could be a Lennar community that benefits from this kind of model. But historically, though, you're right. It has been used more often than not by somebody who's building a single home. But it could be a 20 home project, a 30 home project, or the like.
Yep.
And so, then the question is, do you instead include the cost of the land in the loan? Right. That's what gets you into the AD&C bucket. So, do you include in the development construction loan the cost of buying the land? And the reason why I separate those out is the land can be the riskiest part of the transaction often, and it got some lenders in trouble in the run up to the crisis, and so it scared off folks like Sandra Thompson because they had this experience with AD&C lending way back when, and community banks, which ran into some trouble mainly with the land piece of this. And so when we went to FHFA with the construction to perm idea, a while back, because I sort of helped the Obama folks do this, push Sandra on it way back when. Her experience with AD&C lending scared her off of even the construction to perm stuff. And we were trying to distinguish the two initially pretty unsuccessfully, I think. But it's just worth remembering that you've got these different sort of tranches of risk, as it were, that you can make an intelligent decision about what you want to back as the GSEs. You can go all in and do AD&C, but you can also do 2/3 of it. And you've got there's really an economic question of how much do you feel like you need to support?
To answer Jeremy's early question, Fannie Mae, up until I think 2001, did that. They had a product. It was a single closed C2P. The only issue with it is that you cannot securitize in MBS, at least at the time. You can't securitize a loan on something that has zero collateral. You have to wait till the collateral actually exists. And so at the time, it was a portfolio / MBS product,
Yes.
meaning it had to be held in portfolio. That might be thrown out as like you can't use a portfolio. There's no legal reason at this point that Fannie Mae's portfolio can't be open to holding these for a period of time. And Jeremy, to your question, this was being done not long ago. Like the pipes, the policies, the guidelines, everything exists at the GSEs. They could turn it on probably within a month and start participating. So I just wanted to clarify, like, one potential objection is the portfolio. I don't think that's meaningful, and the fact that this is doable immediately.
Yeah, I mean the portfolio limitation is a contractual one, and that's not a prohibition on using the portfolio. It's just a limit on how much balance sheet you can have. But that's a dial you can toggle up or down in contract.
On AD&C, it's not a single family loan, though, right? I mean, so if you were to go all in on the land financing, what does that look like to you? And I know Fannie's done it in the 80s. I just don't know exactly what structure they did before, but there's all sorts of structures it could take.
To me, it's more of a policy question initially of what loans you want to consider. That is, what level of liquidity you feel like builders actually need, and then the rest of it's a design question, which is not, I don't think, that complicated. I mean, the portfolio limitation is not a real limitation, so I'm not worried about that. You're right, though; you'd need it in order for this to work because you can't securitize it without collateral. AD&C lending has typically been for larger developments because one of the biggest costs tends to be land. So if you leave that out, it is a constraint on what builders are going to be willing to do. And so what may wind up happening is the AD&C vehicle ends up being the more important vehicle for larger projects, and the construction to perm ends up being enough for small to medium-sized builders doing small to medium-sized efforts. And so the question may be, as a matter of what market flaw are you trying to solve for? It may be a policy question of which you feel like you need to do. And that part of that is, is this do we want to make this a multi and single family development liquidity play, or just one or just the other? And that takes you down the path of AD&C versus construction to perm, I think. And then the last piece of this, it's important to remember that you don't need to provide a liquidity for the entire debt obligation of these builders. The market is already in position to provide some of it at a level that is where the cost of capital is bearable. The way to think about it is, it used to be, up until say 10, 15 years ago, that a builder could go out and get, multifamily builder could go out and get 2/3 of the cost of their project covered buy a relatively traditional construction loan at a cost that they could bear. But what's happened is the community banks that often provide those kinds of loans have lowered the LTV so much that you can really only go out and get like a third of the cost of a project. And so the builders are then forced to go out into the equity markets to get much more expensive capital to cover the rest. And so what some folks have suggested over the last couple of years is that the GSEs could just provide liquidity for some mezzanine tranche of all this. And so they don't need to go all the way down to the bottom of the stack. They could just provide liquidity for, say, the middle third. And if they did that in a way that was cost effective, many more deals would actually pencil out. So there's a world in which you don't even need to cover the entire capital stack. You can just cover the middle, which will reduce the amount of portfolio or obligation the GSEs have got to put on the line, but also unlock a fair amount of construction, because it's that middle piece right now that's so expensive that it's knocking a lot of folks sort of out of the game, as it were. So again, how much of the loan, what kind of loans do you want the GSEs to create liquidity for? So are you folks are more on single, more on multi, big projects versus small to medium? And how much of the debt do you feel like you need to create liquidity for in order to make the math of all this work? And those are somewhat complicated questions, but they're not unsolvable. And once the GSEs can wrap their heads around what the answers to those are, which are just a matter of sort of the market economics of the moment, then you can begin to develop a product that creates a secondary market, that creates an execution for the kinds of loans you want to support at the level you want to support them.
So I think, Jim, also your proposal, which I think is the exact thing they should do, this sort of idea of step in, do the mezzanine financing. It actually answers two of the other objections I've often heard to this proposal, which is, number one, is you're crowding out private capital. Well, in this case, no. Private capital will operate where it's financing today. We'll just sit on top of that and make the deal pencil out better. And then number two is the GSEs don't have the expertise to understand how to finance building, which is fair to some degree. But again, this becomes like a dust-like model where banks and others are doing their current thing. They're figuring out everything. And then the GSEs are just coming on top of that to make it more affordable. I think the only question that I don't have a great answer for is that, well, the GSEs should behave like private market players. And if they're going to take on this new financing role, it means figuring out what the rate of return is for them and what the capital requirements are. And do you do this in a way that's subsidizing costs, which clearly you want to, because that's the benefit here. But how do you solve for the capital? How do you solve for that? How do you solve for these things on their books when they eventually do get recapped and released? That's the one piece I know is challenging. But I mean, again, the execution, everything to me is very clear on how they could do it.
Yeah. And to the private capital crowding out piece, it's important to remember that the reason why we're having this discussion is there's not enough private capital in the space. So it's not as if we've got private capital in the space and we just don't like it and we want to replace it with public capital somehow. It's that we don't have enough private capital. And as a result, we're not seeing enough stuff built. So all we're saying is if you add this layer of government-backed, GSC facilitated capital, then it's going to unlock all of this other private capital to bring to bear to see the building that we need. So it's not crowding stuff out; it's facilitating the entrance of yet more private capital. And then as to the how to make sure you get the capital levels and subsidy levels and all that right, part of it is, as you see on the demand side, the GSEs just have access to capital and a level of standardization that gives them an advantage that makes it easier for them to provide value in the market than it does a lot of others. And then so that's an unsubsidized piece of this. But then they provide right now about $5 billion a year in cross subsidy anyway. It all goes to demand side help. It all goes to lowering the interest rates modestly on those that receive the subsidy. It seems to me that it would make sense to hive off a little bit of that in order to help solve the biggest problem we've got right now, which is not a demand side problem, it's a supply side problem. So I think the GSEs, even in an unsubsidized way, could provide a lot of help, unlock a lot of private capital investment, but they'd increase that substantially if they were allowed to transition a little of the cross subsidy they already generate over into this effort.
Yeah, that's such a critical point. The one worry I have is that, if you look at the GSEs and have this view that there should be no more cross subsidy, and go in and sort of undo pricing and lower pricing for all the sort of high quality business, lower pricing significantly for investor loans, which are a considerable source of subsidy, and then raise pricing on everything else, you end up with a really valuable tool that the GSEs have, which is they generate a lot of money in cross subsidies. And if you make the argument, hey, we don't want to spend those cross subsidies on business that otherwise would go to FHA, or business that's not really getting done today, or it isn't really helping and it's just stimulating demand. I think that's the argument you're making. I think that's a fair one, that those subsidies can then be redirected, eliminating the cross subsidies. And I just want to be very clear about this, because there may be a Republican tendency to do that. You're really giving up a very not only important tool. And I hate to say, like, hey, it's a great thing for policymakers to be able to use them as a piggy bank to accomplish policy objectives.
Mm.
Yes, you're giving that up, but also as a private market participant, you would do some degree of cross subsidies, which we see in a lot of other markets, because that enables you to find pockets where you are able to invest in.
When I say cross subsidy, all I mean is you're getting a lower ROE in some segments because you've got a higher ROE in others. So you're still getting a return. There's nobody you're not making loans at a loss. You're just you're getting $10 a loan from your investor properties when your target per loan is only 6, which allows you to get only $2 a loan from your mission properties. You're still getting $2 a loan from the mission guy. You're still making a profit off of them. It's just because of your investor property giving you $10 a loan, you can now go in and get $2 a loan from the mission guy and still get to your target ROE. So all this is still profitable. None of this is implying that they ought to be doing any of this at a loss. It's just you're doing it a slightly less of a profit maximizing level, just because you're getting an even higher profit maximizing level from other pockets. So that's how to think about what I mean when I say cross subsidy.
Let me ask you this, Jim. Is it too disconnected or too indirect to think about it this way, which is by redirecting that subsidy and being very targeted in the supply side, especially if you targeted product and geography, wouldn't you naturally then drive down some of the cost and some of the 30-year burden on the end product on the demand side anyway?
Yeah, of course.
That's the way to think about it. So even taking that subsidy and directing it towards other, and when I say product, let's be clear, I'm referring to modular or manufactured type build. And then also you're bringing more units on. So economics play out the way you would expect, and you could actually get those homes at a more affordable place. It's not direct. Is it too indirect to even say?
No. I mean, the way to think about it is the whole point of all of this is to make housing more affordable for more people. That requires different things in different environments. And right now, that does not mean, putting all your juice into the demand side, because that's not the most efficient way to make housing more affordable. It means, in our case, helping on the supply side. So you've got more supply, so you bring down the upward pressure we're seeing on home prices because of the supply constraints. So you're trying to ease that constraint, so there's less upward pressure on housing prices, which means homes are more affordable. So if the objective in all of this is to make housing more affordable, in some markets, that means helping on the demand side, because some pockets of folks need some demand side help. But in the current market, it means helping on the supply side. So redirecting a little of the subsidy to help there is completely consistent with the overall objective of making housing more affordable. It's just being a little smarter about an environment in which that means helping on the supply side.
But maybe I'm reading a little bit more into, Jeremy, your comment than you meant. But I think the other thing too is if you really focus on specific geographies with AD&C financing, let's say, those geographies could be our homes of Detroit and Cleveland, or newly opened federal lands, wherever it is. If it's time bound and focused, and you're making a sort of capital investment, where you get risky and you're taking a big risk is if there's no other plan to make those areas successful. But if you're smart and thoughtful about where you're investing those dollars, and they're in places where you're making other types of investments, trying to relocate jobs and factories there, other things, then the investment isn't really risky. You're not even really having to subsidize it, because at the end of the day, if all of those things bear out, you're going to earn a lot of money on that investment. I shouldn't say that. I should say the risk of the investment becomes equivalent to the amount of return you're making, because you've de-risked it by doing some of these other things. So I do think that's kind of an important consideration, which is if you're focused on the specific areas where you're willing to do this, versus we're going to open up a new window for anybody who wants to build anywhere to use this financing tool. That to me becomes really risky, because now anybody can build anywhere and you have no control. But if you say, we are going to do this in the following 20 freedom cities where other government investments are going to play, and I apologize for the reference there, but anyway, I don't know if that's kind of what you're thinking, Jeremy.
Yeah, because to Jim's point earlier, I love the framing of incentives and liquidity, but the private market still picks the projects. The private market still picks those areas, those communities, those parcels, those things that they're going to do. And so, to your point, John, you have to be targeted, but you're not making the selection of what goes into the market. You're just providing incentives and liquidity and then letting the market pick the projects and go from there, especially as you think about which piece does that the best, which piece of financing, which type of financing product does that the best, exactly to your point.
Okay, so we covered two major products: construction to perm, AD&C, doable, maybe some headwinds, but I think completely within the means of what the GSEs could do today. Other ideas, Jim, that you've considered in terms of other supply side places the GSEs could lean in?
Yeah, I mean, ADUs are a space too, and this gets sort of wonky in the weeds pretty quickly, but it's just worth noting that ADUs have become this somewhat surprising silver lining in the strained supply side challenge, in the sense that I think in a lot of communities, and this is true in the community where I live, the politics of more aggressive soft density is just prohibitive. And so, as something of a compromise, a lot of local policy leaders have opened up zoning and the like for ADUs where they've not opened it up for more density. And so you're seeing the spread of ADUs, I think more than I think we would have expected 10 years ago, especially in California, but also true in others, mainly as an answer to the supply challenge in communities where the politics of more robust answers are just off the table for whatever reason. But one of the challenges of ADU, the spread of ADUs, has been that the financing system generally doesn't serve them all that well. Like, it just hasn't figured out a way to create a standardized, scalable product for folks to build ADUs. It works a little better for renovating your house to create an ADU from it, but that's not really creating supply for you. It's just sort of, helping your own existing supply set at the margin. So if we want ADUs to be more of a supply solution, we got to figure out a way, I think, to make it easier to get financing to go and build new stuff. And that's complicated, and probably is going to take an iterated process to figure out how you can include prospective rent, in underwriting, an ADU unit and all that. But I think that's something that the GSEs could help us with, along with FHA, could help us with. I don't know what the solution is, but it's going to have to be something that's more standardized, more cookie cutter, in a way that becomes more scalable to those that want to take advantage of it. That's a niche-y sort of thing, I think, that might help at the margins.
Look, this one's not hard. Second liens are not new products. This nonsensical Freddie Mac second lien pilot thing is ridiculous. Both the GSEs have done second liens for many, many years. Let's just say, okay, we can do second liens. That's really the tool that you need to finance ADUs on existing properties. The two things that make it challenging: number one is today, for some nonsensical, weird translation of ability to repay rules, income from an unbuilt ADU is not able to be counted towards the underwriting. Just nonsense. That's just literally is interpretive. Somebody just needs to say, I now interpret it this way, and we're done with that one. And then secondly, the other challenge is, like, when you do any sort of renovation kind of product with Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, the lender is on the hook for the risk of the construction to be complete. And that basically means like lenders need to hire people that are going to basically become a second layer of construction oversight and have to like check to make sure stuff is done. That also is very solvable. It just takes a little bit of willingness to just say, hey, we're willing to take a little risk here. We're going to do some technology oversight of this versus like put lenders on the hook so they don't get sale treatment. So anyway, a second lien product that fixes those two problems that the GSEs lean in on, do enough volume to start securitizing. That I'm making it sound easy. I know that's a little bit more complicated, and I apologize for the wonkiness of that, Jim. But look, that's not rocket science. That is sort of
no, you're right.
GSE.
Totally right.
That's what they can do, and that's what they should do in this ADU financing space.
But if you go back, if you take a step back and think about, if you're Bill Pulte coming into this job and you've decided, hey, like I'm a construction guy, or at least come from a construction family, I want the GSEs to find ways to help on this side. Like this is the sort of thing that's not that hard to figure out if, as the director, you decide it should be a priority. I think similarly, coming up with ways to support the secondary market for pieces of the supply side puzzle in the way we were talking about before, I think that too is, it's kind of in the GSE's wheelhouse. It's not nearly as unfamiliar and foreign as I think folks tend to think. It's just a matter of the senior management deciding this is something they want to solve for. And I'm pretty confident that senior management at the GSEs is actually game to do this. Like, I don't get the sense that the CEOs are reticent about this. So I think it really is just a matter of Pulte himself deciding, hey, this is something that I want to try to solve on my watch. I'm going to give, you guys at GSEs some runway to do it, to come up with, pilots and other stuff to figure out how to solve for this. And to the degree there is a mission component of the GSEs, if I'm Bill Pulte, this has got to be part of that. So it feels to me like the big question is, do they shift to this as a priority? Because if they do, I'm pretty confident that the problems that we've mentioned are solvable with the expertise the GSEs already have on the ground as we speak.
Yeah, and I'll just make one maybe final comment on this, right? Because Jim, you and I come at this politically very differently, and I think if you're going to accomplish this, you're going to want to make sure that you can create some amount of alignment. Although I'm pretty sure that that's not a high priority for this administration. But the thing I want to say is, look, American housing is not something that people really get inspired by right now. We've struggled to build it. Frankly, a lot of it's really ugly. A lot of our homes are old and deteriorating. The idea is that if Bill Pulte leans in on this, leans in on construction, leans in on ADU creation, leans in on something Jeremy mentioned earlier, like really incentivizing the use of industrialized construction. We just heard somebody from Pulte yesterday talk about a lot of the things that they're doing to use new technology. But right now that technology hasn't gotten to where it needs to be. It needs an extra push, and it needs scale and volume to really invest the capital and automation to get there. But what I think is really inspiring and should be inspiring for everybody, regardless of what side of the political spectrum you're on, is we can make housing great again, right? There's so much room for improvement, not only to build homes on the affordable side, which I agree is important, but I think if we become overly focused on building cheap homes, we're not going to ultimately build enough homes. We should be building lots and lots of beautiful homes of all shapes and sizes. Let the market determine what it can bear. And the more homes we build, the better it's going to be for everyone. And I think if the message sounds like we should use the GSEs to cheapen finance and subsidize low cost tenement housing, it's going to sound miserable to everybody. And I know that's not what you're suggesting, Jim. I wanted to put a fine point on this. This is building amazing, beautiful homes, opening up new parts of this country and creating housing that leaves a lasting legacy, which I think is something that a Donald Trump has shown he's very, very interested in as a real estate developer, and something that I think would really appeal to Director Pulte as well. So,
yeah. I mean, the market is the only part of the market that is being really well served with building is the very top. So it's not as if the only market flaw is at the very bottom. There's a market flaw in the middle. So right. We need an enormous amount of supply, really from the middle on down. And if you can focus on building out the middle, it'll also help downstream too. So I don't disagree. I don't see this as a Section 8 effort. I see it as a workforce housing plus kind of effort.
Yeah, same here. Yesterday, John, there was a lot of talk about innovative building materials, but when you actually talk to the industrialized housing folks, what you find is their 2x4s don't age any differently than 2x4s on site built homes. It's the same 2x4s in a lot of cases and the same materials. So to get this started, we're not actually talking about innovative materials yet. They're there. We're getting there. We heard about them yesterday, but we're really just talking about processes, standardization, and productization.
That's right. That's right. Well, that does it for this episode. Hey, Jim, I just want to say a huge thank you to you for chatting through this. A super important topic, a great, great discussion. I know a little wonky, but I think really important for everyone to hear what's really possible with the GSEs. So to all the listeners out there, we'd love to hear from you. Send us any of your thoughts at podcast@thehousinginsiders.com. If you like what you hear, leave us a review.
And always subscribe and share our episodes so that we can do more of this. And thank you, Keenan Chen, for our opening music.
Yeah. And thanks again, Jim. Really appreciate having you on.
Yeah, thank you guys.